In September 1865, a Pennsylvania hill farm that no one had ever bothered to farm sold for $2 million. 5 months earlier, the same land had changed hands for $100,000. 5 years later, the federal census counted 237 people living on it. 14 years after that, the county bought the entire town site back for $4.37, less than the price of a meal. In between, roughly 20,000 people had lived there. 6 years earlier, in 1859, Edwin Drake had drilled the first oil well in the world a few miles away outside Titusville. Within 6 months, 500 wells lined the 16 miles between Titusville and the Allegheny River. Pithole Creek itself had been ignored by that first wave. It ran through rough hill country that smelled, according to one historian, of sulfur and brimstone, and speculators preferred the flatter ground along the bigger creeks. Nobody had even settled on why the place was called Pithole. One theory pointed to natural fissures in the ground venting sulfurous gas. Another traced it to ancient pits, lined with oil-soaked timber that predated European settlement entirely. It started in January 1864, when a speculator named Isaiah Frazier leased 35 acres along that same unpromising creek from a farmer named Thomas Holmden. Frazier had already made a quick $250,000 drilling nearby, and he wanted another well. He formed the United States Petroleum Company with 3 partners, James Faulkner Jr., Frederick Jones, and a Wall Street financier named J. Nelson Tappan, and started drilling what they called the United States Well, or the Frazier Well. On January 7th, 1865, it struck oil. Within 2 weeks, 2 more wells on the same creek, the Twin Wells, erupted as well, each producing roughly 800 barrels a day. Stock in Frazier's company, which had been trading at $6.25, shot up to $40 overnight. Word of a gusher on Pithole Creek spread through the Pennsylvania oil region in days. In May 1865, 2 speculators, A.P. Duncan and George C. Prather, bought the Holmden farm outright, the same ground Frazier had only leased, for $25,000, plus a $75,000 bonus. Call it $100,000 total. They cleared the wooded bluff overlooking the wells, laid out streets, and on May 24th, 1865, put 500 town lots up for sale. They named the place Pithole. What happened next is the part worth sitting with. By July, at least 2,000 people were living on raw, muddy hillside. By September, that number was 15,000, and Pithole's wells alone were pumping roughly 6,000 barrels of oil a day. About 2/3 of everything Pennsylvania produced. Elsewhere along the creek, half-acre plots with nothing on them were selling for $3,000 apiece. That same month, Duncan and Prather sold the Holmden farm, the land under the entire town, for $2 million. They had owned it for 4 months. By December, the population hit roughly 20,000. In less than a year, Pithole had grown 54 hotels, 3 churches, a daily newspaper called the Pithole Daily Record, and a 3-story, 1,100-seat theater that opened its doors on September 17th. Its post office, tucked into the ground floor of the Chase House Hotel, became the 3rd busiest in Pennsylvania, behind only Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. The town's first hotel, the Astor House, was built in a single day. The walls were so full of gaps that guests froze through the winter. On October 9th, an oil buyer named Samuel Van Sickle opened the world's first pipeline, a 5.5-mile, 2-inch pipe that could move 2,500 barrels of oil a day, doing the work of 300 horse teams. A railroad reached the town 2 months later. A second, more ambitious line meant to bypass the whole route through Oil City was started the same year and never finished. It went bankrupt in 1866 and was torn up for scrap before a single train reached Pithole on it. None of this had existed 18 months earlier. Most of it wouldn't exist 18 months later either. Behind the newspaper and the theater, and the third busiest post office in the state, sat a town where, by one contemporary account, every other building was a BAR, and a red light district on First Street operated openly enough that a Pittsburgh newspaper later compared it to Dodge City's. The borough council passed ordinances against it and staged raids. Neither did much. Duncan and Prather didn't wait to find out. They sold their remaining interests in the town before the crash came. Prather split an estimated $3 million with his two brothers and settled in Meadville, Pennsylvania. Duncan took his own fortune and went home to Scotland. The record doesn't put a number on what he carried with him, but it was enough to leave. The people who stayed were the ones who paid. Teamsters hauling oil barrels through Pithole's unpaved streets went through horses so fast that the animals had to be shipped in by rail from Ohio and New York. The oil soaked into their coats, and most were dead or unusable within a few months. That was the smell and texture of daily life in a town built entirely on extracting one substance as fast as possible, with nothing underneath it once the substance was gone. The wells didn't hold. The Fraser well itself ran dry on November 10, 1865, 10 months after it made Isaiah Fraser a small fortune and set off the entire boom. In March 1866, a chain of banks controlled by Charles Vernon Culver, an oil developer who was at that exact moment a sitting member of the United States House of Representatives from Pennsylvania, collapsed. Culver had helped found 13 banks across the East. When his network failed, it triggered a financial panic across the whole Pennsylvania oil region, and the money that had been flowing into Pithole simply stopped. Fire finished what the panic started. On February 24, 1866, a house fire spread and burned down most of Holmdon Street and parts of two others in 2 hours. On August 2nd, a second fire tore through several city blocks and destroyed 27 working oil wells outright. By December 1866, less than a year after the town's peak, the population had fallen to 2,000. Over the following year, new oil strikes elsewhere in Venango County pulled away most of what remained. People did not just move out. Some of them dismantled their own houses and businesses and hauled the lumber to the next boomtown. By 1868, Pithole's newspaper had relocated to a town called Petroleum Center. The Chase House and the theater that had once sat 1,100 people were sold and moved to Pleasantville. The 1870 census found 237 people left in Pithole. In August 1877, the borough's charter was formally dissolved. There was no longer, legally, a town there to govern. 2 years after that, Venango County bought back the entire site, streets and all, for $4.37. And Charles Vernon Culver, whose bank collapse had helped detonate the whole region's economy, he was arrested and imprisoned in 1866. Still technically a congressman, he did not run for re-election that year. After what was described as a prolonged trial, he was acquitted. He went right back into the oil business, running operations out of Franklin, Pennsylvania, a few miles from the wreck he'd helped cause, and lived another 43 years, dying in 1909 at the age of 78 on a business trip. No one else connected to Pithole's collapse fared any worse. Duncan kept his fortune in Scotland. Prather kept his in Meadville. The people who had sunk their savings into hotels, lots, and a town that lasted about as long as a bad harvest simply absorbed the loss and moved on, or did not. Nobody touched the land for almost 80 years after the county bought it back for $4.37. In 1957, a newspaper publisher named James B. Stevenson bought the old town site, cleared the brush that had swallowed it, and in 1961 gave it to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1973, official recognition more than a century late that something had happened there worth remembering. The fullest account of what actually happened at Pithole did not appear until 1972, when a historian named William Culp Dara published a book called simply Pithole, the Vanished City, more than 100 years after the last hotel closed. Today, the site of Pithole is an empty field with mowed paths where the streets used to run. A walking tour of the whole town site, every block that once held 20,000 people, 54 hotels, and a post office busier than almost anywhere else in the state, takes about 42 minutes. There is a visitor center, a scale model under glass, and grass growing over the ground that once sold for $2 million, then for less than a beef dinner.